Hi, welcome to my studio. This is Karen Margulis and this is An Artist's Life. And today we're going to be talking about paper. Now, paper can be a very challenging thing for us pastel artists because we have so many different choices of paper available to us. Are we going to use sanded, unsanded? Oh my gosh, my dog is ringing the bell. Hold on just a second. Okay, I'm back. Heidi rings the bell when she has to go outside, so maybe she'll come in and make an appearance. But back to what I was talking about, paper. So what are we going to do for paper? I have a lot of things that I could say about paper, a lot of suggestions, a lot of tips, and too much to fit into one video. So what I thought I would do is start off by talking about what my current favorite paper is. That is Uart paper. So I've got my Uart t-shirt on, I'm ready to go. And what I want to do for you today is just do a very quick pastel demo on Uart paper. And I'll talk about the paper as I go, as I demo. And then when I finish, I'll answer some more questions. I get a lot of questions because people know that Uart is my current favorite. So I'll try my best to answer all your questions today in this demo. So let me step on over to the easel and we'll get started. Okay, so I'm back at the easel. Now, why is Uart my favorite? Probably right now it's my favorite because I find it to be the most versatile paper. Meaning I can easily do a wet underpainting and not have to worry about the paper buckling or wrinkling or any of that good stuff that paper likes to do when it gets wet. I find it stays nice and flat for the most part. And I think the reason behind this is that I don't get it overly soaked. So every once in a while I go crazy with a watercolor and I get it really wet and it will buckle, and then I just lay it under a heavy book and it flattens right out. But here's an underpainting I did this morning. It's a simple alcohol wash. Just like this, it has not buckled, it dried perfectly flat, so I'm ready to go. I don't have to wait for it. And so what I'm going to do is paint on this one, but I'm going to show you a little bit about the alcohol wash. Now, another thing about Uart that makes it very versatile is that it comes in several grades of paper, like sandpaper or grit, and it just goes from a very rough paper to a very smooth sanded paper, and it is a sanded surface. And by the way, it only comes in this one color. It's a very pale creamy color, so you don't get color choices. But as far as having a choice of how rough you want the paper or how much tooth it has, how much it will grab or layer the pastel, you've got a wide variety. And just for your information, the lower the number, the rougher the tooth of the paper. So the low numbers are rougher than the high numbers. So an 800 would be the smoothest and the 240 would be the roughest. And I have a visual aid that I'll share with you in a little bit after I finish painting. So I'm going to do a very simple alcohol wash, and what I've done already is blocked in on this lower one. I've blocked in my main shapes. I've simplified the scene into just 4 or 5 big simple shapes, and I'm going to use one value and kind of create a value map. So I'm going to know where my lights are and where my darks are, and that will allow me to play more with the color. I'm using a dark blue new pastel. This happens to be a number 305, but you can really use any dark value pastel. And I've already blocked in the dark areas, which are the trees and the reflections, and then I've left the sky and the water untouched because that's the lightest value and I don't really want to have a big mess of dark, so I'm going to just leave it untouched, and then it'll get just a little bit of color it'll pick up from the brush. Now I'm going to be using regular rubbing alcohol. You can use water, you can use odorless mineral spirits, anything to wet or liquefy the pastel. And I'm choosing alcohol mainly because it dries faster and because I like the drips that you get with it. You can see in the dried underpainting, if you look carefully, there's some really interesting drips that happen from when the alcohol is drying, when it evaporates. I'm going to start off when I do an alcohol wash, and by the way, I'm using a very cheap stiff bristle brush because look how worn down it gets with use. You don't want to use your good brushes. And I'm going to start with the lightest areas first. and that happens to be the sky. And really when you come in and do the sky, it'll just pick up some of the blue from the dark masses, and we'll just give a little bit of touch of color to the sky. And I'm going to go do the same thing for the area in the water, like that. Now, one thing that I do when I'm doing any kind of wet underpainting or especially an alcohol wash, when I wet the pastel, I then turn to painting mode with a brush, because really what we're doing is we're turning the pastel into paint. And so I paint with the brush rather than just wet everything down. So I really think about what it is I'm painting and try to describe that shape by the way I make my brush strokes. So here I'm trying to make some kind of bushy or random strokes for the tree shapes. Now the reflections I'm going to do, let me just wet down the grassy area. The reflections I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm going to pull them down, because I want them to look like they're being reflected in the water. So hopefully they'll drip, and that will really help give that illusion of wet, which will be very useful. And then we'll let that dry. And so that's step one. That's the underpainting. Now I already have one that's dry, so I'm going to actually move right on into that. Kind of like the cooking channel, I have one already ready for us. I'll just take it out of the oven and here we go. So I'm ready to paint. Now normally when I paint, I choose the colors that I use first. I pick my palette. Now today what I've done instead is I'm working with, let me hold it up so you can see it. This is the Great American Richard McKinley landscape set. Every once in a while I like to challenge myself and say, you know what, I'm going to use that set today and see what I can do with it. And so I'm going to start with this set. First thing I'm going to do is reinforce the dark areas. So wherever I have a dark shape, I'm going to come in and put a dark value pastel and just kind of build up those darks and make them a little bit more interesting. So I already have one layer of blue. I'm actually going to add probably 3 layers of color on here. And again, we're talking about Uart paper, so we know it's a sanded paper, and we can get quite a few layers. I happen to be working on it's 600 today. I typically like to use the middle grade, so I use 400, 500, 600. Those are probably my favorite go-to grades. I chose 600 today because I know I'm going to be painting reflections in the water, and I really want those reflections to be smooth, like glassy. So the smoother paper, the 600, will allow that to happen. Notice what I'm doing. As I add a color up in the tree mass, I pull it down below in the reflection. And I don't make the marks in the same direction. Instead, what I'm doing is I am using a different way of making marks. So, for example, I'm making my marks in the trees kind of in a random way to suggest the foliage. But when I come down to the reflection, I use these same colors and I pull my marks just straight up and down, vertical strokes. If I were to make them the same marks as up in the trees, they'd look like trees growing on top of the water. And I want them to look like they're in the water. So I'm going to add a little bit of a soft peachy color in here in places. And the reason why is because this was early fall, and so the leaves were just barely starting to turn. So I want to kind of give that little bit of impression of fall. So now I've got 3 colors up into the tree mass. And I still have to develop the trees, but I'm going to move on. And next, I'm going to develop the lights. Now, the lights in this case, the light area will be the sky. Now, an interesting thing about this photo, my reference photo, is, and let me show it to you here. Put it up a little bit closer. It's a really kind of crummy little photo. And I like to use crummy little photos because they allow me to be more interpretive of my subject. And what I see in the photo is a white sky and white water. And it's white because it was overexposed. But in real life, when I was there, it was not white. It was probably a very, very, very soft pale blue. And so that's what I'm going to put up in the sky. Whenever you come across your reference photo and the sky looks white, probably wasn't white. And so you want to think about what color. If it was overcast, it might be a pale yellow or a pale pink or maybe a pale lavender. But if you paint it as white, it's really not going to be as much interesting. I'm adding a touch of peach to the horizon area, and I'm going to then do one more thing. What I'm going to do is I'm holding out the colors that I've put down in the sky, because I'm going to use those same colors down in the water. So when I get to the water, I don't want to have to hunt for those pastels. Now what I'm going to do is start on the trees and refine the trees and move down. First thing that I want to do in the trees is create some trees that are in the distance, so a distant tree mass. And so I'm going to come in with a nice blue purple, very light blue purple, and kind of sneak those in behind the trees, so it suggests that there's trees in the distance that are further back. Okay, so they're not as dark, they're not as colorful, and they're just kind of set back in the distance. Next thing I want to do is develop this little bit of grass. So I could go ahead and go right in with the green. The grass is going to be green, but then I wouldn't have much interest. So what I'm going to do instead, excuse me, is sneak in some dried grass color. So I chose a peach color, and I'm going to lay that down, a little bit lighter value. And this peach color is going to act as the dirt. You could call it the dirt or the dried grass. It's just going to give a little bit of interest and excitement to the green. So I put down that layer first, and now I'm going to come back on top with my greens. Before I do the grass, let's go ahead and finish the trees. So I have this really nice dark shape of trees. I don't have any form to the trees. Some trees or bushes are going to be in front, some are going to be behind, some are getting a little bit more light. So very, very lightly I'm going to take a lighter, warmer green and scumble it over in the areas where I think those trees would be receiving more light. I'm pulling out the form of the trees kind of from that dark mass. So instead of me painting every single leaf on the tree, what I'm doing instead is painting the base of the tree, the dark, simple shape that is the trees, that are the trees. And then I can gradually pull them out from that dark area by changing color and changing the values of the colors that I add in there, and keeping that dark mass intact. So that dark mass serves as the foundation. And now I can sort of decorate with all my leaves and all the little final details that I want to put in. Now one thing you want to do is when you put a color above the water, you're going to drag it down into the reflection. Now, so I'm pulling some of that green down into the reflection. You want to make sure your reflections match up with what you have on top. So I'm going to have to refine them a little bit so that they match the shapes that I'm putting above the water. There are some kind of general rules of thumb about reflections, and I actually would like to do a complete demo on reflections. So just to keep things simple for today, I'm putting what's above the water down below in the water, and that's going to do the job for me today. So I've got reflections, I've got trees. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in the grass, and I'm going to start in the distance here and make some thin horizontal lines so it will give the appearance of grass setting down, or like sort of in the distance. I wouldn't see the way the grass was growing back there, it's too far back. But as I come forward, that changes and I can see a little bit more detail, so I'm going to actually start to make marks that go more in an up and down fashion to show sort of the way the grass might grow along the edge of the marsh right there. And I'm using several different greens to accomplish that, make a variety of greens. And notice a lot of that peachy color that I initially put down, I'm allowing that to peek through. So that way I have a little bit more interest in my greens. It's not just a big green mass. Put a little bit of purple stuff back in there. There's some purple things growing, so it gives a little bit more interest. If I want to add a tree trunk, I'm going to use the side of the pastel and press down and make some marks and make some little indications of trunks. But remember, if you put it above the water, it's going to be reflected below the water. So whenever you're adding things, don't forget about your reflection. And I'm going to cover that up just slightly. It's too light. Go back with the dark. That's why it's always a good idea to have your pastels out, the ones you use, so when you make a mistake, it's very easy to pick up the right color, find the right color, and make those corrections. Then finally, I'm going to finish up the reflected areas. I need to find that dark green. There we go. And I'm going to take those colors that I had up in the sky, I'm going to put them down, but I'm going to make horizontal bands to represent the water. One thing I want to do before I do that, I'm going to actually take my finger and pull those reflections down. I'm going to soften them so they look watery, and I'm going to pull them all the way down into this water. And I'm just using my finger. You could use a blending tool if you wanted, but just on a small piece of paper, I don't mind using my finger. Now I'll go back and put in the water. Starting with the darkest color that I had up in the sky will be the water that's closest to me, and then I can get a little bit lighter as I come up towards where it's reflecting in the horizon. Now one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the areas match up. So if there's a dip in the tree line, I got to make sure that corresponds in my reflection. And a lot of times when you're making changes to your reference photo, you don't want to look at the reference photo because it no longer matches what is happening in your painting. And so I'm going to go back and adjust that reflection to reflect what's happening in my painting and not necessarily in the photo. Don't let your photo fool you. And this goes in a little bit right here. This goes in a little bit right here. And then I'm going to ever so lightly take the blue and scumble it over that dark reflected area, just to give sort of a little bit of haze of water. And then the final marks I'm going to make is I want to darken the base or the bank just slightly. I kind of lost the darks in that area. There we go. And then I'm going to just give a little bit of flick of light at the edge in a few places. And that will sort of indicate where the current is, or where it's kind of licking up at the edge of the bank there. And finally I'm going to come in with a few harder marks to suggest just the movement of the water. Pull that down. And the last thing that I want to do is add a little bit of spice mark in my grass, just to give a little bit of eye candy. And how about a little bit of that peach up here? Again, to help move the eye around the painting, put some interesting bits of color. And that's it. I'm going to call that one done. And now let me talk and answer a little bit more on the subject of the paper. I hope you enjoyed that quick demo. I wanted to answer a few questions that I've gotten about Uart paper. First of all, starting off with the idea of the fact that it comes in various grades or grits. And what I've done is I made a paper test. Let me show you what I have. And I actually tested the paper at each grade using the same pastels, painting the same little painting, so that I could see for myself the difference that the paper made in the resulting painting. It's really hard to see on camera the differences, but what I'm going to do is post photos on my blog, on my website, so you'll be able to zoom in, click, and enlarge them, and you'll be able to get a better idea. But there is a difference. The rougher the paper, the more grainy or textured feel to the painting. The smoother, the 800 for example, is very, very smooth, which is probably going to be better for fine detail work. I also did a layer test I'll zoom this in here. And I got up to 21 layers of pastel on both the 240 and the 800. I don't know that I would ever do more than 21 layers in one painting, so I think that was sufficient, but know that I probably could have went further. So it really takes a lot of layering, and it takes a lot of abuse. And I wanted to talk about that, abuse. A lot of times I hear some of my students will say, well, I really can't get sanded paper because I'm not good enough yet. So they use the cheap stuff, and they struggle on the cheap stuff. And I've always been told that we should use the best materials we could possibly afford. And I want you to start to think in a different way. Yes, sanded paper might be slightly more expensive, but you get more bang for the buck because it is durable. This painting probably went through 3 or 4 different reincarnations. I brushed it out, I sprayed it, I did alcohol wash, and yet it took the abuse. So think, if you do a painting and you don't like it, on regular unsanded paper, you might have to throw it out. On sanded paper, you can revive it, redo it, you know, it's durable. So in the long run, you get more bang for your buck. You get it's well worth it. So don't say that you're not worth it, but you know, try to think of it in a different way. And let's see, I wanted to talk about Uart coming by roll. Now I've gotten a roll of Uart paper, and the question is, how do I get it flat? And I've tried various ways to flatten mine, and probably for example, I've re-rolled it back upon itself, and when you do that, this has been rolled up for a couple of weeks, so this will be the moment of truth. Then you kind of relax it, and then you'll have to flatten it back out the other way. But I've had the best luck by just taking some water and spritzing it on the front of the paper lightly, and then weighting it under paper and books, and then it will flatten out. So if you have any other tips or suggestions, please share them with us in the comments, and that will be helpful to everyone. And then finally, I wanted to say about mounting Uart paper. Now, I don't mount my paper, but you can buy Uart already mounted, pre-mounted. And the one thing that I've noticed about that is that the pastels perform a little bit differently on the mounted paper. And I've heard this from a number of other artists as well. I'm going to hold that up a little bit closer so that you can see. This is on mounted Uart, this painting, and it has a pronounced texture. And if that is due to, I don't know if it's the material that it's mounted on or the adhesive, but it just doesn't perform the same way. It's not bad. I actually really enjoyed the texture, but just know that that could be a possibility when the paper is mounted. And finally, how does sanded paper compare to unsanded paper? In other words, how does a painting look when it's done on sanded paper versus unsanded? And just to give you an idea, this is a painting I did yesterday, and it's the same thing that I did today, and this is on Canson paper, and so it definitely has a different look. Let's take today's painting and have a closer look. And again, I'm going to put these both on my blog so you'll be able to see them. But paper choice does matter. So whether you use sanded or whether you use unsanded, think about your choice because it does matter. And I hope you do give Uart a try. I'm gonna talk about other papers in future vlog posts. So I hope you'll stay tuned. And thanks again for tuning in.